Here are the eyes of the Lord on those who fear him. I would like to tell you about a few stories connected by some details, characters, scenarios. These are stories that built a history for a country, a history that could be told. But they also carry words or passages that couldn't find room in the construction of the myth of this new republic. Passages that were erased or forgotten, and in some ways, they still haunt us. These stories weave a relation between the modern Brazil, the foundation of the nation, and the period known as the gold cycle, as Brazilian colonial centuries were divided into different cycles of exploitation: wood, sugar, gold, coffee. What I'm trying to investigate is a certain desire for the future that defines the country, and how this desire implies a longing for the past. In parallel, I am also looking at the ways in which such historical moments are recorded and recuperated, putting in jeopardy the idea of myth, tale, legend, and document. For some reason that I am still wondering about, the gold cycle became some sort of golden era. Everything that happened at that place and time is considered foundational for the country. The first national hero, the first national artist, the birth of Brazilian art and literature, all that came to life in Minas Gerais in the 1700s. This is Ouro Preto, photographed by Marc Verrez in 1881. And this is Ouro Preto recently. These cities, abandoned with the rarefaction of gold and the advent of the next exploiting cycle, remained quite immutable and are nowadays referred to as historical cities, as if being historical meant to be unchanged by time. Anyway, I would like to begin with the story of an attempt for freedom, I was going to say, but the correct word would be independence, not more than that. The first tale I would like to tell you is that of a group known as the Inconfidentes, unconfident, or traitors. In this case to the king, or more precisely the queen, which was formed and dismantled in the mountainous regions of Minas Gerais in the late 1700s. This inconfidencia, or betrayal, is considered the foundational desire for the creation of a new nation. It is not true, as we will see, but it is still quite revealing. In 1785, Dona Maria I de Portugal e Algarves, back then called the Pious and later known as Maria the Mad, signed a law that prohibited factories, manufactures, and looms in Brazil, since, according to her text, the real and solid richness consists in the fruit and production of the land, which can only be obtained through settlers and farmers, and not through artists. The meticulous queen makes one exception: thick cotton fabrics that serve for the use and clothing of the blacks, to bale and pack fabrics, and to other similar ministrations. Any other ones shall be terminated and abolished in any place where they can be found under my reign within Brazil. It is not strange that Dona Maria would want the settlers to continue dedicating themselves to harvesting fruit and other products from the earth. 1/5 of all the gold that was found should end up among her treasures, and the law also stipulated that an absolute minimum of 1,500 kilos of gold should be brought from Minas Gerais to the crown's trunks every year. In 1789, more than 1 million kilos of gold were owed as delayed taxes, and the governor announced this ought to be paid by force if needed. In this context, the elite from Minas Gerais began planning their independence. Amongst the inconfident, there was a canon and 4 priests, one of them also a known slave and diamonds trader, 3 poets, one of them also a lawyer, the other 2 having positions in the local government, a couple of doctors, at least one minor, 4 captains, 3 coronels, 2 lieutenant coronels, 1 lieutenant, a major sergeant, and 1 second lieutenant, also dentist. If on the one hand they were triggered by the impositions of the Portuguese crown, on the other, they were also inflamed by the news regarding the recent independence of the US, declared in 1776, and the ideas that flourished in Europe towards the French Revolution. Minas aristocracy felt as a part of this movement. On October 2nd, 1786, José Joaquim de Maia, a medicine student in Montpellier, writes a letter to the American envoy in France, Thomas Jefferson, that begins with these words: "I am a native of Brazil. You are not ignorant of the frightful slavery under which my country groans." Not the slavery we might be thinking of. He was only referring to the relation between metropolis and colonies. "This," he continues, "continually becomes more unbearable since the epoch of your glorious independence, from an apprehension that we may follow your example." Thomas Jefferson then writes about this to John Lay, one of the founding fathers of the United States of America. He says, they need artillery, munitions, ships, sailors, soldiers, and officers, more or less everything. And for all this, they are resolved to approach the United States, always under the understanding that provisions and services will be paid for. I have never heard this before. I never knew that the plan included international contacts and that it attempted to hire the knowledge and the arsenal of the recently founded USA. No one told me this in any history class. I was always presented with the idea that the uprising was quite naive, belittled by the government before it could actually even take form, that the group was more preoccupied with the design of their flag than prepared for action. The flag turned out pretty good, minimalistic, white background with a green triangle and the phrase in Latin, libertas qua sera tamen, liberty, even if late, in the official translation. Libertas qua sera tamen respexis inertem is Virgilius' complete verse. Something like liberty, even if late, had pity of me in my inertia. And they might have been, in fact, a bit lethargic or slow in their actions. They were holding the burst of the revolution for the day in which taxes would be charged by force in order to gather the support of the unhappy people. Before that day came, the conspiracy was dismantled in 1789, thanks to Joaquim Silvério dos Reis, who handed his cameras in exchange for forgiveness of his own debts, a bit like Judas and Jesus. The unconfident were accused and condemned of crime of lèse-majesté, or high treason. 12 of them were sentenced to death. 6 were banished from the country, and 2 exiled for 10 years in the Portuguese colonies in the African continent. 1 was sentenced to forced labor, other 2 were sent in peace, 4 were absolved, and the 5 religious ones were sent to the convents in Portugal. 3 died in jail while waiting for their trial, amongst them the poet Cláudio Manuel da Costa, whom they declared committed suicide, hanging himself in his cell from an unlikely height, like Vladimir Herzog during military dictatorship almost 200 years later. The day after the sentences were proclaimed, a letter of mercy from Dona Maria I transformed all death sentences into exile punishment, with the exception of that of Joaquim José da Silva Xavier, known as the Tiradentes, that who removes teeth, who was still condemned to the capital punishment. Instead of the cruel death predicted by law, however, he was sent to hang. The sentence was executed publicly on April 21st, 1792, at Lampedusa camp in Rio de Janeiro. In this painting, Tiradentes meets the hangman on his way to the gallows. The executioner brings the white gown the condemned to death were obliged to wear at that time. Both are barefooted. Well-polished shoes cross the same patio between 1826 and 1914, where the old prison became the headquarters of the Chamber of Deputies. It was then demolished in the belief that deputies deserved a building made for the purpose of housing them. This was built over the same soil, finished in 1926 and named Palácio Tiradentes. The painting being donated to the Chamber of Deputies in 1959, it only remained above the soil it represents for 1 year, until the capital of the Republic, with all its bureaucrats, their archived and documents and unfilled forms, their pens and erasers, their furniture, framed photos, and decorative objects, were transferred to Brasilia. This photo was taken during the voting process of Dilma Rousseff's impeachment in 2016. Tiradentes before the executioner was reproduced on the backside of 5,000 cruzeiros banknotes and occupied people's hands and pockets from 1964, the year of the military coup, until 1974, the year of my first birthday. Back to 1792, the warm body was taken to Casa do Trem, the train house, where it was quartered. The trunk was given to Santa Casa de Misericórdia for studies. The head and the 4 extremities were put into salt inside leather bags and taken to Minas Gerais, being exhibited along the way in places where Tiradentes had declared his revolutionary ideas. The head was exposed in the central plaza of Vila Rica, in front of the House of Government. This sentence to death by hanging with no right to sepulture was then called pena de morte para sempre, death forever punishment. On the first night, his head disappeared from the high post where it was exhibited and was never found again. During the mid-1930s, President Getúlio Vargas determined that the remains of the inconfident who died in exile ought to be taken back to Brazil. The bones of those that could be exhumed arrived in 1937, same year that Vargas started his dictatorship period known as Estado Novo, New State, a time when it became fundamental to create the narrative of a national history. In 1938, the building of the Casa de Câmara e Cadeia de Vila Rica, which by then was the state penitentiary, allocated one of its main rooms to the Pantheon of the Inconfidentes, inaugurated on April 21st, 1942, the 150th anniversary of Tiradentes' hanging. That same year, the creation of the Museu da Inconfidência was announced. It occupies the same building since 1944, and the Pantheon hasn't moved. The collection has also remained untouched until 2005, when a new museography was designed by the French specialist Pierre Catel, who created a new narrative in the rooms accompanied by new displays and lighting. The arrangement of the 2 remaining pieces of Tiradentes' gallows, however, was not changed nor commented. As I said, the Inconfidência, or betrayal, plays the role of the foundational desire of independence in the construction of a history for the country that accompanies the creation of the Republic. Yet, there is other tales to be told. One of them is that of zombie, from the Kimbundu language, ghost, spectre, or from the Mbagdala language, that who was dead and comes to life again. Zumbi also ended with his head cut and salted, but that is the end of the story. They say Akwaltuni was a princess, daughter of the king of Congo. They say she was a warrior, that in 1625 she led an army of 10,000 men in the Battle of Minobuila against Portuguese invaders. They say she was imprisoned with the Congolese defeat and sold as a breeding slave on the other side of the Atlantic in Brazil. They say that in the last month of her first pregnancy, she organized an escape from the mill of Porto Calvos to Palmares, a quilombo or settlement of fugitive slaves existing from circa 1605 until 1694. They say she became leader of one of its most important mocambos. They say her 3 children were born there, Ganga Zumba, Gana, and Sabina. They say Sabina was the mother of Zumbi. They say Zumbi was born free in Palmares in 1655, but was captured when he was 6 years old and given to the Jesuit priest Antonio Melo, who baptized him as Francisco. They say he received the Holy Sacrament, learned Portuguese, Latin, and algebra, and helped during the Mass. But when he was 15 years old, he escaped the city and went back to Palmares. They say perhaps this is when he received the nickname of Zumbi, for having returned to life or having returned from death. That same year, in 1670, his uncle Ganga Zumba became leader of Palmares, which at that time was a republic with 11 mocambos, more than 200 kilometers of extension, and 11,000, 16,000, 20,000, or 30,000 inhabitants, depending on the consulted sources. In 1678, Ganga Zumba and the governor of Pernambuco, Pedro Almeida, signed a treaty of peace, the Treaty of Cacau, which emancipated all Palmarinos, but kept in captivity all African and descendants who were not living in Palmares at the moment or born there in the future. They say Ganga Zumba was murdered with venom of a serpent, Dankbe, the sacred serpent of Uida, who rules immortality and is believed to have opened the eyes of mankind. In Brazil, it became Uxumaré, represented by the snake and the rainbow. How the poison met the body is not known, but with his death in 1680, Zumbi becomes leader of Palmares and takes back the word given by his uncle to the white man in power. Perhaps due to knowing white man's words better, or to having learned during his youth in company of the Jesuit what it meant for them to be free in such a society. There would not be peace unless freedom was for all. It never is, and new attacks to the Quilombo took place, until the last one in 1694. They say Zumbi was wounded and fled with a group of 20 men. Some say he should have taken 19, as one of them, Antonio Soares, apparently betrayed him. Some say that Captain André Furtado de Mendonça, when arriving to the hideouts, calls his name 3 times, Zumbi, Zumbi, Zumbi. Some say Zumbi took his own life, others that the traitor killed him, that the captain murdered him, or that he was the victim of his entire troop. A letter to King Dom Pedro II of Portugal and Algarves, known as the Peaceful, written in March 1696 by the governor of Pernambuco, Caetano de Melo Castro, states that, I quote, "A small and thin body was presented at the assembly of Porto Calvo, upon which 15 wounds made by bullets and many made by spears were found during examination." The letter also states that The virility member of said black man had been mutilated and put inside his mouth, and that he was missing too, one eye. The head was removed by a black man in the patio of the assembly. The governor continues in his letter. I ordered for his head to be exhibited in a post at the higher spot of the square, to frighten the blacks who superstitiously believed Zumbi to be immortal. The king, thankfully, gives an award of 15,000 reis to Capitán Furtado de Mendonça for having killed and cut the head of the black man from Palmares, Zumbi. I wonder which eye would he be missing, and where could it be? In what moment and with what type of instrument was the eyeball taken from the inside of its hole? There is something in these extreme violent gestures with the body that projects life where there is none. Yes, because I don't believe he was taken hostage and tortured to be later killed with 15 shots. I believe he could only be caught when dead. Even though this violence is perpetrated onto a soft and warm corpse, as if it could still feel it, as if it was impossible to ascertain until when does life last. Other heads come to mind, such as the disappeared head of Tiradentes, of course, but also those belonging to Antônio Conselheiro and to Lampião and Maria Bonita, all kept at the Ethnographic and Anthropological Museum Estácio de Lima in Salvador, the first one until consumed by a fire in 1905, the others a long 30 years, until the family gained permission to bury them. Apart from keeping the mummified heads of criminals and enemies of the government, the museum also collected weapons and instruments used in crimes, marked cards, fake money, devices used to hide and transport illegal substances. The collection also encompasses objects of cult belonging to Afro-Brazilian religions, which until the 1960s were also gathered as crime evidence. But this is a whole other story, with its own traitor and all. An interesting detail for our narration is that of the eye. The almost unbelievable story says that it was during a confront with the police, when a bullet reached the cactus and a poisonous thorn blinded his eye, the right one. And this is what proved the salted head to belong to Lampião, the eye, the wounded eye. In the same way as Tiradentes, or the teeth remover, became the first national hero, so also Aleijadinho, or the little crippled man, became the first national artist, national avant la lettre, as at the time the first was planning a revolution and the second was carving altars, the nation itself did not exist. In any case, 4 years after Tiradentes was dead forever, Aleijadinho started to work in what would become his main oeuvre, a group of 66 wooden sculptures representing the last days of life of Jesus Christ, in the sanctuary of Bom Jesus de Matozinhos, Congonhas, Minas Gerais, from the Last Supper to the Crucifixion. In a very Baroque way, the sculptures were thought to be seen from a specific angle and arranged in particular way, in which their postures and gestures and the lines of their looks would form a precise whole, even if we will never know which. The first scene, that of the Last Supper, was the only one to be completed before the author's death, also forever, I tend to believe, even if by natural cause. It depicts the moment when Jesus reveals the existence of a traitor amongst the apostles seated around the table. They all look around, surprised, in an expression that should have lasted seconds. And yet, each frozen sculpture awaits almost a whole year for the return of Easter in order to insert into the narrative and relive those few seconds in which their gestures and expressions are actually present. It is Judas, the traitor, with the low look in his eyes and a bag of coins in his hands, that is the center of our next tale. Let's begin with the narration of a traveler, Richard Burton, a man who translated 1001 Nights and the Kama Sutra into English. Presented by Wikipedia as a British explorer, geographer, translator, writer, soldier, orientalist, cartographer, ethnologist, spy, linguist, poet, fencer, and diplomat, in this order. Between 1865 and 1868, Burton was the British consul in Santos, Brazil, and took the opportunity to travel the country and write his Explorations of the Highlands of Brazil with a full account of the gold and diamond mines. In it, he describes the local costume of a stab in the region that represents the left eye in the sculpture of Saint Judas Iscariot. Anyway, in his narration about their visit to Congonhas, we can read, "My wife complied with the custom of the place, took the knife from Judas his plater, and dug it into his eye, or rather into a deep cut, which cleaves in his left malar bone, the eye, the bone. By being precise about the exact point to hit, and to make it clear that the area where the eye should be represented was disfigured, Burton does not make reference to the wood behind the carnation, but instead to a bone beneath the flesh. Stabbing a sculpture is an act of faith, but almost a stronger belief is revealed when talking about its bones." If every one of these sculptures becomes alive during one instant every year, this Judas becomes yet more alive each time he is stabbed. What interests me in this repeated relation with the sculpture is this physical and violent action with concrete results on the subject matter, is the pulsation that allows for an artistic object to at times acquire a sense that transcends it. Each and every single time in which the representation of an eye was perforated by a metallic blade, it incorporated another existence, one of a real eye and also of a mythic eye, from an inanimate sculpture to real traitor and to the incarnation of all treason. I like to think of the belief that moved each hand at the precise moment of reaching out for the knife and then jabbing. I imagine a dry bang on the hardwood, the features sculptured in the cedar and reaffirmed by the polychromies, the mouth, for instance, immutable, the representation of the eye giving in, little by little, giving place to a real wound. Richard Burton's book, with the first account of this stabbed image, was published in England in 1869 and was not printed in Portuguese until 1941, same year of the first edition of Brazil Land of the Future by Stefan Zweig, in English and Portuguese, among other languages. Right after the first restoration of these sculptures, when the area where Judas' left eye was recovered with a mass of encaustic, Lorival Gomes Machado writes Reconquering Congonhas, published in 1960, the year of the inauguration of Brasilia, our futuristic capital. In it, he mentions the savage demonstration of pity from that who, a long time ago, shot a bullet at the left eye of Judas' image. This story was not confirmed by other sources. It is, however, very interesting that Gomes Machado, artistic director of the first Bienal de São Paulo and the city's Museum of Modern Art in the early 1950s, is also author of this and another classic book about Baroque in Minas Gerais. He is not an exception. In 1938, the year when the bones of our foundational traitors were buried in what was still a jail, Oscar Niemeyer, the architect of Brasilia, built his Grande Hotel a few blocks downhill. Our past is not fatal. We remake it every day, wrote art critic Mário Pedrosa in a text about Brasilia in 1959. A curious choice to refer to the past while introducing the futuristic city is still to be concluded. It has been a while since I think this desire for the future that characterizes the country and is solidified in the modern forms of the once new capital is tethered to the past and, I came to think recently, politically conservative. In fact, when the new capital, now aged and outraged, was inaugurated, someone in charge of the ceremonial had no lighter an idea than to bring an old iron bell from a mountainous town 900 kilometers away. Why the sound of this heavy symbol of colonial past needed to be heard at the open space of Praça dos Três Poderes is hard to guess. But on April 21st, 1960, the bell from one of the first chapels in Vila Rica tolled for the birth of Brasilia. I imagine the bell being taken down from the tower with ropes and pulleys, I suppose. I imagine it being transported through the narrow, steep streets of Ouro Preto and from there to Belo Horizonte. I imagine a small aircraft and a serious pilot. I imagine the debarkation, the expectation, the wooden structure waiting at the square, the lifting, the knots, the suspension. I imagine Amador Gomes exiting the same plane with his eyes on the staircase. I imagine him lifting his head and looking at the new capital, which he couldn't have seen yet, not even in pictures. I imagine his astonishment, shared by all, in face of the future that seemed to be at last present. I imagine Amador Gomes, Amador is an amateur, whom I recently heard was a bell scholar rather than a bell ringer, counting time until the agreed moment, his hand on the rope, his heartbeat. There was another 21st of April, the one in 1792, when someone waited anxiously for the right moment to sound the same bell. Amador Gomes stood by for being best seen. His predecessor was a shade in the dark, holding back to move quiet, without being identified. And when the bell resonated, nobody, or almost nobody, expected to hear it sound. At least this is the story told. The bells in the whole country were forbidden to chime during the day and night of the execution of Tiradentes, traitor to the crown. But it is said that when the night was already dark and silent, the insomniac inhabitants of Vila Rica could recognize the well-known sound of this one bell. What sound is this, which only this bell can produce? What can be the audible quality that made it necessary for this and no other bell to vibrate on the same day of so different ears? What is this sound, then, capable of paying homage, secretly or publicly, clandestinely or officially, to both the traitor who became the first hero and the city built to be the third and last capital of this one country? I imagine this sound and its echoes in one place and the other. In his discourse for the instauration of the executive power in Brasilia, President Juscelino Kubitschek, the local JK, acknowledges the desire of bridging together these two dates. He says, "We salute at once the past and the future of our homeland through two events united in the common ideal of affirming Brazil as an independent nation." It might have been a score-settling move. One can understand the wish to make peace with his ghosts. The traitor, on his turn betrayed, then hanged and quartered, and later called back as the first national hero, killed by the state before the birth of the nation. One can understand why Brasilia would be the terrain for this retribution, to start blank. One can also realize the advantages of making it subtle by connecting these two historical moments through the presence of the abstract sound of a bell. One can't help but thinking of this lapse, however, the small slip or grave error of recalling the insurrection by the date of its punishment and through this lament for its repression. Then came the future. From the same central square in this new capital projected for brighter times, thousands of new murders were commanded by the state during the following decades, and no bell ever tolled. There is something unique in the way bells are played in Minas Gerais. The craft has been declared national immaterial heritage. Like a secret society, bell ringers instruct their successors. Since childhood, they hear, they stay around to help, they look while all listen, they obey, they observe. They memorize jingles and gestures, they train with sticks on lamp posts. They learn the different sounds used by each parish to call for a mass or a novena, to count the hours, to announce a fire, a baptism, a wedding, a funeral. The different sounds that anticipate the burial of a baby, a woman, a man, a priest, a pope, a monarch, one for each authority of a different kind. I have listened to them many times and have come to believe that it is in the way bells are played and in how they sound that the presence of African cultures brought by enslaved men and women is mostly felt around these churches. Not so much in the carving of the altars or the colors of the images, as it is sometimes said. I imagined freed Africans and their descendants playing these bells, maybe the same ones that would light the candles and snuff them out. I imagined their hands carrying the flames, their faces illuminated by fire just before extinguishing each appearance of it. I imagined their arms moving fast to reach sounds that bells were not made to produce. I imagined that gradually, by repetition, African rhythms might have carved invisible changes on the iron of those European bells housed in Brazilian churches, impermanent sound impregnating the metal. I imagine our African legacy clandestinely present at the inaugural moment of the wide central city through the sound of that bell, accustomed to percussion.